Let's bring back my colleagues, Vashi Kapellas and David Cochran now. Vashi is going to take over coverage here in about 10 minutes, and she'll have lots of analysis and reaction and an interview with Chrystia Freeland as well. Vashi, I mean, what should Canadians take away from this? It is, as we pointed out earlier, the first really detailed look at the country's finances since March of 2019. It's almost astounding how much has changed. I was just going to pull out what the deficit was then. It was $34.4 billion. In 2019-2020. So to think of all the things that have changed and the government has had to do and the amount of debt it has had to take on.
Yeah, I think that is sort of underscored by what I walk away from reading this document and listening to the comments, thinking that while there was a feeling in the summer like the worst of it could be over, and therefore the government could acclimatize its response in correspondence with that, and various governments, to be fair, could. That feeling seems to have been erased, and that's reflected in what we heard today, both through what the government presented and how the opposition reacted. So while there are thoughts to what may occur when a recovery happens, I remember months ago sitting with you talking about how we expected the summer update to be all about that recovery. Yeah. And in fact, it talked about it, but now it's almost been put aside. And yes, there are some signals about what it will include, but certainly the majority of what's presented today by the government and then criticized by the various opposition parties in different ways is still about how they are responding to the needs of people. And as we just heard from your guest, the healthcare needs of people, the economic needs of people and businesses in this country right now, because we are in some cases in a worse off spot when it comes to the pandemic than we were months ago. And that just sort of really hit home for me through what we heard from everything today.
Yeah, David, I mean, it's true that things are, they are worse in some parts of the country, and they are still bad mostly everywhere. So how you sort of lay out a fiscal plan going forward is a challenge, but it's also one that the government needed to do. I mean, they needed to show us and give us a sense of what things look like.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, Rosie, is that we're still very much in the emergency phase of spending. I know we all want that emergency phase to end and the recovery phase to begin, and that sort of felt like it was happening back around Labor Day, and it does not feel like it is happening as we get closer to Christmas Day. And I think that's a big lesson in all of this. I mean, look at the measures that are there. They've extended the wage subsidy out to June, and it's going to be topped up to 75%, boosted from 65% until March. So you have those sort of measures, and the rental subsidy being enriched and expanded and extended because there is a recognition that businesses need to be kept whole for a longer period of time than was anticipated when these programs were first launched, with varying degrees of success and failure. But if you look at the longer-term economic picture, just look at the stimulus spending promise. I know it's kind of gray and amorphous. It's up to $100 billion, over 3 years. That tells you that we will be in this for several years. I don't mean the lockdowns. I mean the vaccines provide, an end to that should the rollouts happen and the approvals come. But in the best case scenarios in this document, economic activity and employment levels are about 18 to 24 months away from getting back to pre-pandemic levels in the best scenarios, up to 5 years in the worst scenarios. So even when we get through this emergency phase and the spending can wind down a little bit and the reopening can begin to some degree, it's going to take a long time to get back to pre-COVID normal, if we can even go back to that. And this is in the aggregate. On an individual level, it may never really kind of happen. I mean, the best indicator we have is kind of for the really hard hit sectors like airlines, for example. After the global financial crisis of a decade ago, it took until about 2015 to get back to normal. And that was after the shock of 9/11 took a bunch of years for air travel to get back to normal. We are going to go through a similar phase like that again. So as big as the spendings and investments and supports are outlined here today and in past events, there will need to be more in the future to do that, and also to solve the social inequities the government has been pointing to in the pandemic. How the newest, the poorest, and the oldest Canadians have been the most affected by this. The investments that need to be made to help racialized Canadians, new Canadians, and quite frankly, women get back to an economic level, that's going to take some serious time.
Yeah, and as you say, this is all assuming that things sort of go as we would hope, and not that things would get worse or there would be a third wave. I think Dr. Fauci on the weekend said that, for instance, the United States seemed to be seeing a surge upon a surge. So, that's hoping that nothing like that happens here. I want to get one last thought from both of you on the politics of this, because yes, it's an economic document, it's a support document for Canadians, but there's lots of politics at play here too. Vashi, what would you point Canadians to there?
Well, the criticism is very different depending on the party that is criticizing what the government has put forward. The Conservatives they said that the deficit was too high, and their main critique focused on vaccinations and a plan for distributing them, or what they would say is a lack thereof of a plan. A polar opposite approach from the New Democrats, for example, who were focused on, I think Peter Julian in the House of Commons talked about that there being too much austerity in what was put forward, which kind of, he was heckled a little bit almost in the House of Commons, and a little bit of a sort of joke made by Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, out of that, saying, I expected a lot of criticism for a lot of things, but probably not that, just given the size of what they put forward. So very different approaches. I mean, there's more to what the NDP was saying, and we'll have the leader of the party, Jagmeet Singh, on a little bit to talk about that. But then, from the Bloc Québécois, more specifics on healthcare transfers. And I imagine that's where a lot of the conversation from provinces will go as well. So I think politically it wasn't unsurprising. Like I wasn't shocked by any of the criticism that came forward. I also wasn't really shocked by much of what the government put forward too. It was kind of to be expected.
Okay, Vashi, thank you for your help with this coverage. Vashi's going to take over coverage here in 5 minutes' time, so stay tuned for a 2-hour edition of Power and Politics and full analysis, as well as interviews with all the big players. David, let me get one more thought from you on the politics of all this.
Yeah, it seems if you listen to the opposition parties, their essential assumption is that the government has failed Canadians broadly, and they all get to their judgment of failure by taking very different paths. I mean, if you listen to Erin O'Toole, there's the frustration that we're still in various stages of economic lockdown, that perhaps testing and various things haven't accelerated to the point that they would like it. Even though many of those things are not necessarily within political control, those are the decisions of health regulators, and many of these things are not in federal control. They are the jurisdiction and the provenance of the provinces, and there's always a feistiness whenever you try to intrude into their sphere of responsibility. The New Democrats, it's interesting that the biggest deficit really since the Second World War is being described as austerity by Peter Julian.
I bet you they won't say that again, I would guess.
They may not. I mean, look, they have been consistent in wanting to see broad-based reforms to the tax structure in Canada, to go after wealth taxes and different things like this. And these are fundamental conversations that we may want to have in a time where there has been pandemic profiteering. But I go back to this central point that we're still very much in an emergency phase of trying to put a financial floor under people. And it's hard to think about redecorating the house when the house is still on fire and the fire department hasn't quite left. I mean, if you look at where these conversations started in September, we're looking at a throne speech that promised a great, ambitious green agenda, or at least the spin leading up to the throne speech projected these things. And look at where we are with the second wave now, with Alberta as a cauldron, for example. There are very fundamental, immediate crises in front of governments at every level that still need to be dealt with. And it's very difficult, I think, to wrap your head around long-term structural changes to things when you're trying to figure out how to keep the main streets of Canada alive and ensure that small businesses and the Canadian family are too big to fail in this crisis.
I only have about a minute, David, but I mean, it did strike me in the response from opposition leaders that you can start to see sort of the frame of what the economic debate, or what the debate around what this country looks like going forward starts to look like. From Erin O'Toole saying that this government has been too paternalistic, that people need to get back to work, that they're willing to do what's needed, to the NDP calling for more of this, that, and the other. I mean, you can sort of start to see the thread lines of how that conversation goes when Canadians are ready to have it, because I'm not sure it's now.
Yeah, and I think the final point, if we look at like the fiscal guardrails that Chrystia Freeland talked about today, I think that will guide how they approach it, the Liberals do as a government, in that they're not going to look at GDP rates getting back to a certain level, or economic output on the aggregate level getting back to a certain level. They want to look at the economic well-being of individual Canadians, and that's employment levels, the employment rate, the unemployment rate, but more importantly, hours worked. Because it's not just Canadians losing jobs in this crisis, it's losing full-time employment or having their hours slashed down to such a point that it's not enough to live on. And that's what a lot of these support programs have been about. So as we move forward to whatever this stimulus and recovery is, and whenever it does begin in earnest, that's going to be interesting to see exactly what they land on there, what the indicators are to either ramp up or wind down stimulus spending as needed.
Okay, David, thank you for all your help with our coverage. You can watch David tonight on The National. He'll bring you all the highlights to